I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you're not in a good relationship with your kids and it has really nothing to do with anything except maybe feelings, your kids didn't steal from you, they didn't burn your house down, maybe they chose a career you didn't want, or maybe they're hard-headed or heavy-handed or things that don't really amount to anything, then I suggest you be the bigger person that you're supposed to be and reach out to your children. Whether they're 20 years old or 50 years old, you always, as the parent, hold the power in that relationship. The kids were actual kids while you were an adult. You were never a child while your children were children. And parents are gods to their children when they first start. When I was 8 years old, my mom was everything. And the idea that she is 100% A-OK with not speaking to me and doesn't care what I'm doing in life, positive or negative, that has something to do with how I relate to other people in the world. That power dynamic. When I'm in a position of power, whether it's somebody maybe I'm dating and they're a little younger than me and I'm leading, or if I have kids, or if I get married in light of being the man or something, it affects how I see power dynamics. It affects how I move about in the world. And again, every relationship is different. I'm not talking about if your child pulled a gun on you or is trying to kill you, or if if your grown adult son is trying to fight you. But I'm talking about if it's things that have to do with feelings. You're as the parent, you're causing so much damage. You're just, whatever weight you have. I think of my mom. My mom's been twice divorced. She's a black woman. Whatever terrible things, you think that she might have endured, passing them on to me is not the answer, right? And not working with me, treating me like I'm one of the black men that divorced you, that does absolutely nothing to me. And then surrounding yourself with white people who already dislike black men, and will side with you. I've had not my mom, I've had other people that I know, part of the church or whatever, find a way to, when I was in the Seattle Times, they caught wind of the Seattle Times. I was on the Joy FM. I had a radio interview which plays in Tampa, Florida, even though I'm up here in Seattle. And I had Christians from the church I grew up with contact me, not my mom, but them. And they contacted me just to ream me a new one for not being in my mom's life. I moved 3,000 miles away from home because I couldn't nobody wanted to work with me. Nobody wanted to talk to me. It was just, Randy, you're a bad person. You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So I left and I went and pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I had a career with University of Phoenix. I had a short career with Progressive Insurance. I worked for car dealerships and sold cars. I made upwards of $70,000 a year. And then I taught myself how to cut hair. I was in the Seattle Times. I had Christian radio stations interview me. I had college kids interview me for their final projects at University of Washington or Seattle University or Bellevue College or City University, and on and on and on here in Seattle and in King County. And what do these people do? They call me to ream me a new one when I did exactly what they told me to do 25 years ago. I stopped asking them for help, and I went out and pulled myself up by my bootstraps. And what do? They just find reasons to hate me. Just find reasons to hate me. No, I'm not, I don't have a bunch of kids that don't know me. I don't have any kids. I've never been married. I haven't ruined any woman's life and divorced her and left her penniless with kids. I've never been to prison. I've been to jail over traffic tickets, right? Things like that. Getting mad at the guy who pulled me over and end up spending the night in jail because I couldn't shut my mouth. I don't have any debt. I don't have any student loan debt. I think I owe Singular Wireless like $200 from the early 90s, which, to be quite honest with you, I'm never going to pay that. I don't even know if Singular Wireless is a company anymore. Right? I'm just trying. I'm not a gang member. And I think it says something when you pull yourself up by your bootstraps from living under a bridge or under a bench. Utterly homeless, no friends, no family, no skills, and got to go out and get a job and have a 7-year career with University of Phoenix when you started interviewing in old used clothes while you were homeless. That's how I got that University of Phoenix job. That's how I ended up in the Seattle Times. Right? But they don't look at any of that. Right? They don't see anything positive to say about that. Right? It makes me feel like there's nothing good in me. Right? Now I sit at 48 years old. Right? Like when my mom and her white Christian Baptist friends in the South were telling me that I was no good and I didn't have the ability to do, for no reason, just because they wanted to say these things, right? I don't have anything in my record that says I'm some wild child, right? As a matter of fact, most people say I'm articulate and, I'm homeless right now. I seem to be in a decent mood. I'm even talking about personal things, and I'm not flipping out or anything, right? And so it just seems as though there's nothing that I can do that's acceptable. There's no good thing that I can do that's, I would think when you're listening to Joy FM and you hear, yeah, we've got a interview a guy in Seattle named Randy Miller who's from the Tampa Bay area, and he's going around giving free haircuts in Seattle as a homeless man himself. Randy, glad to have you on. Why don't you? Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me on. I give haircuts in the name of the Lord Jesus. I wrote a book that outlines how I started, how I was in the Salvation Army, and during COVID there was no work, so I prayed, and God told me if I want a blessing to be, and I'm on and on and on, and you hear all of that. And what do? You find my social media, you find my phone number, and you contact me just to talk shit. But you're the one that's going to inherit the kingdom of God. Right? Like, I feel like I followed your advice. Right? I stopped asking my mom for things, right? Things that I think you should be able to ask your mom for. You're 17 or 18 years old, right? I wasn't 50. I'm not even 50 yet, but it's not like I was a 50-year-old man sitting on the couch playing video games, asking my mom to make me a sandwich. Hey, mom, meatloaf. That's not what was happening. I was asking my mom for work boots. I was asking my mom for rides to work. I was asking the men at the church to, invite me out to pick up basketball, but they don't want to do any of that, right? It was pull yourself up by your bootstraps in every area of your life, Randy. You not only do you not need anybody for anything on earth, but you shouldn't need anything for anybody on earth. Like the fact that you have to ask for one single thing means you are not a man. Now, you got to understand, these white Christians, they weren't involved in my life growing up, right? I went to their church, but their advice from sunup to sundown, from birth to the last day I saw them, was pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Whether it was homework in junior high school, Randy, you gotta study hard. Now what you have to understand is all of these people had plenty of help, including my mom. Right? All of these white people, Christians, they were helping my mom. Right? They weren't helping my mom with her family. They weren't helping us with our relationship. Right? But they were giving my mom advice on this, advice on that, telling her the best places to move, this and that. But nobody was ever working on our family unit. right? Everybody was working on their own family, but they were working on splitting hours. They would, I imagine, based on how my mom treated me, they were telling my mom something like I was no good and I was going to grow up to be even a worse grown man and this and that. And the fact that I don't think these things are inherent, right? I think outside influences kind of might push a parent to be like this to their child. And I just don't think my mom was getting good advice in light of family. In the South, especially amongst white people, and my mom chose to go to an all-white mega church, like a Joel Osteen church, they're big on family when it comes to them, right? See, they see a single mom as a broken family. Right, they're from what I could tell and seeing how they behaved, if you have a husband and a wife and kids and a career, that's family, right? What me and my mom had, it was some type of broken thing that did not have the ability to be fixed. The Word of God says to be a father to the fatherless. See, I didn't get that. I got, hey, 8-year-old Randy, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You got to work harder. Nobody's ever going to do it for you. Hey, 12-year-old Randy, you got to stop being so emotional and stop screaming and yelling, and you got to do that. They didn't want to show you. They didn't want to train you. They didn't want to raise you. They didn't want to be a father to you. They just wanted to, as they were walking away, shout instructions or something to that. Something to that effect. So, part of, my mental health issues and things like that is really to just understand, did I have to become the first black president for my mom to love me? And we're not even talking about my dad. Dad been gone, right? Like, what did I have to do for that nigga to love me, right? And none of these, moving from state to state. We got to Florida when I was about in junior high school. I was born in Germany. We moved to Washington. We moved to California. We moved to, not having a dog, not having brothers or sisters. The white megachurch, they didn't look at any of that as an obstacle. It was always pull yourself up by your bootstraps. They didn't want to help with that. They didn't want to help me. They didn't want to welcome me to the area. They didn't want to be hospitable. They didn't want to be they just wanted to tell you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's Bell Shoals Baptist Church in Brandon, Florida. And I just, these white people had zero interest in me and my mom's family, and to this day we don't speak because I'm not interested in a Joel Osteen lifestyle, and Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy and, evangelical Christians in the South have no interest in anything but telling me to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. They're not interested in coming around me once the pulling up starts. You understand? They're interested in watching you from start to finish while they're eating popcorn, watching you fail, watching you struggle, watching you, because pulling yourself up by your bootstraps takes time. That's not, you don't just snap your fingers and you're pulled up. It might take me a year or 2 or 3, especially with no help. You mean to tell me my brothers and sisters that I grew up with, my Christian family, brothers and sisters, my mom, my aunts and uncles, the community, society, absolutely zero help. Well, if you're hungry, too bad. Because they all got help, right? Like these white people that are telling me to pull myself up by my bootstraps, if they get hungry, they got somebody to call. Right? They got a brother, they got a sister, they got a mom, they got a dad, they got a church, they got friends, right? They got the government, right? I could never go to Wells Fargo and get a loan, right? They've got careers, they've got all sorts of all sorts of help. Right? You know, when I go to the food bank during COVID, you know how many Mercedes I saw outside the food bank? Right? There's shame when I go to the food bank or when I use food stamps, but when they use it, it's all okay. And my mom fell right into all of that. You know, for some reason, no matter what I do it like a dirty nigger, like an irresponsible, filthy nigger who just can't be right. I had 2 documentaries made about me that played in Cannes Festival and Seattle International Film Festival, and is hopefully on its way to the Sundance Festival, I think, in Southern California. But to the people that I grew up with, for some unknown reason, like I just think of all the black stereotypes, and I taught myself a skill. I mean, my story is fabulous, but I guess my main point is, I think one of the reasons why I'm not taking off while I could and while I still feel like I'm a little in the sunken place is because I think God intended for there to be a bond between you and your parents. I don't think that's strange, and I get from white people who really just don't want to see black people rise. These evangelical white Christians, you know, they just keep coming up with instead of standing in the gap, they come up with reasons why I don't need anybody to stand in the gap for me. You understand? It's like they'll preach you don't want to be a Lone Ranger Christian, but then again, they don't want to help you at all. It's like, listen, you can't inherit the kingdom of God being a Christian by yourself. So go find some Christians. Right? Don't look over here. You know, don't come to our church. You can come in our doors and sit in our pews, but we're not going to love on you. We're not going to be hospitable to you. We're not going to do any of that to you. You know, because we're not allowed, I guess, for some unwritten rule, we have to let you in our church. We're not going to be your brothers and sisters, right? And that's what I experience, you know. And if you disagree with me, Google me, man. Randy Miller, Seattle Street Barber, Seattle Times, and you know you can go on the Seattle International Film Festival or the Cannes Film Festival, and you know you have to do some searching, but I'm sure you can find the documentary. You can go to the Joy FM. I think it was like 4 years ago I had that interview. You can go on my social media and see other interviews, and you can see all the free haircuts that I give in the name of the Lord Jesus while I navigate a life of faith here in the earth. And it is incredibly painful that Bible-believing Christians and my family, who are Bible-believing Christians, just don't care. You know, and you've seen it on TV, whether I've had cousins or you've seen black people come out 15 years in prison to a warm welcome. You know, 20 family members there. Yeah, you're free now. Good, we love you. And they invite. Instead of complaining, I caught a Greyhound bus ticket and made something of myself, and they hate me for it. I haven't been gone 20 years in prison. I've been gone 20 years making something of myself. And they hate me for it. They hate me. I'm literally sitting here right now at a YMCA, about to go work out, drinking my coffee, not pulling any drive-bys, not hurting anybody. As a matter of fact, going to go help some people. I work a job. I mean, other than this black skin, I don't see. Look, I even I don't even think I look terribly homeless. I haven't taken a shower yet. It's early. The gym just opened, but you know, I see people doing worse than me, just getting loved on. You know, the church loves a drug addict. They love a what would you call it? Seabiscuit. They love a underdog story. They love unless you're black, I guess. I don't know, man. I really just, and I think, one of the things that, a life of doing things a certain way, it's hard for me to go to a black church, right? Because it's, when I was younger, these things were instilled in you. When you're 8, 9, I'm 48 now, but I still have I don't want to say scars necessarily, but the teachings of when I was younger. You can't, you don't, it's not easy to just cast everything. I don't want to start my life over again at 48 years old, and I don't think I need to. Like, I don't think things like, for example, I don't need to get rid of Christianity. I need to get rid of the terrible Christians, right? I don't need to throw Jesus away. If anything, I need to throw these, which I did, which is why I got on a Greyhound and moved. I basically threw them all away. You don't necessarily need to throw everything out in your life, but you definitely need to spit out the bone. You need to keep the baby and throw out the bathwater. And one of my, I guess I don't want to say idols because it's a fictional character, but I'm a big fan of the movie There Will Be Blood and Daniel Day-Lewis. And Daniel Day-Lewis left home, and he left home when there wasn't planes, trains, and automobiles. I guess there were trains, but the idea that it wasn't easy, right? There weren't no cell phones. There wasn't a McDonald's. He packed up and left, right? And to make something of himself, to make his mark, and that's what I did, and I don't know about Daniel Day-Lewis in the movie There Will Be Blood, his character. I don't know if he was encouraged. I don't know if they were, I don't know if they loaded him up with everything he needed and told him to write often, and anything you need on your journey, write, and we'll mail it to you, or what, we'll Pony Express it. I don't know what the conversation was when he left, but with me, there was nobody, right? I'm 17 years old, and I got on a Greyhound to Phoenix, Arizona, and nobody gave a fuck. I told people. I asked people. I'm 17 right now. At 48 years old, I look back on that and I'm like, why would you treat a kid that way? Why would you treat your kid that way? Why would you, as the church, as the youth pastor, what was his name? Something Flores. Victor Flores, another brown person who can't be racist because they're brown, right? You know those people. It's impossible for me to be racist. My last name is Flores, and I'm brown. Of course, you're married to a white Southern woman. No, your children are mixed, so yeah, you most definitely can be racist. I'm not saying all of you are, but I don't know. Your Thanksgivings look rather white. But anyway, the nobody was there. Nobody. The what was his name? Kelly Green, the evangelist. It was called Frontliners, I think, where he had a bunch of youth, and they were frontliners. They preached the gospel and no. Nobody said, Randy, you're making a bad decision. Listen, you've got options here. You don't know. No, I remember I woke up. My mom had left for the day. I looked left. I looked right. I talked to people. I had saved up enough money to get. You know what happened? Well, I tell you, as time goes on, you forget. My mom left. I don't think it was a check. I think it was cash. I told my mom how much the Greyhound bus ticket was, and she left money on the table. And was gone. Right? What was that? I'm 17. And I have a number of other examples, but that stuff just stays with you. That all of that stuff speaks. When you're not speaking as the parent in your child's life, your actions are speaking, right? And again, just to end this, I'm not talking about if you're being, abused by your child, or your child's some crazy criminal doing wild stuff. If it's just a matter of feelings and thoughts, you never listen. Listen to what? What am I not listening to you that you hate me? right? What am I not listening to you that for the next 25 years you're not going to speak to me? And I don't even remember her telling, these people were not involved. These people were not, other than pull yourself up by your bootstraps, there was no instructions. I didn't have, and my mom has 3 pensions. My mom's Claire Huxtable. We ain't poor at all. There was no talk of college. There was no college tuition. There was no, when you get out of high school, we're going to go to community college. There was no conversation. There was no support. There was no, my mom didn't teach me how to be a husband or to raise kids or to be a man or to how to talk to women or, there was no preparation for not being with her. You understand? There was no teaching on how to be a grown adult. There was no teaching on how to buy houses. There was no teaching on credit. There was no teaching on, what people are saying, how to hear the lie, right? There was no teaching on how to shop for apartments. There was no teaching on what a good woman is, the difference between a lady, a girl, and a woman. There was no teaching on how to cook, right? If I got an apartment, what am I going to go to 7-Eleven? There was no instruction on how to not be 8 years old, living with your mom, following her orders. There were no bootstraps waiting for me at 18 years old for me to pull up. There just wasn't. There was just a bunch of you lazy niggas. That was it, because it was just women for me. It was just all the men had left, which as I grew older, again, your actions speak even when you're not. It always stuck with me that my mom and her sisters, she's got, Vicky, Jackie, Sandra, Deborah, and then my mom. So there's 5 of them, right? All 5 of these women have kids and were divorced. And I think most of them were divorced multiple times. And one of the dudes is in prison for life. And I think all of the men were violent to the women. Like my dad hit my mom. Right? Now my mom was a soldier, so she didn't take that shit. But, it always dawned on me how all of these men left these women. Right? And it always dawned on me how my male cousins were. Right? Compared to how men were that had fathers. Right? And I don't want to necessarily say soft or, I've been in plenty of fights. I've never been stomped out, and I think I've won way more fights than I've lost. So it's not a matter of being a bitch or being soft. It's just there's a different expression of manhood when you're raised by a man and when you're not raised by a man. And then it obviously depends on the type of man you're raised by. If you're raised by a terrible man, then it's better to be raised by a woman. But I'm just saying, all things equal, I could see the differences. And then, I could see how the women spoke to us, right? As I got older, when you're younger, it's, we're talking about you, not to you, or you speak when you're spoken to. Well, that needs to change as you get older. As your 8-year-old son grows taller than you, and his chest starts getting full, and he wants to, you're talking about me, not to me. All of a sudden, fuck you talking about, lady? What are you saying about me? I'm 15 now. I'm 17. And if you have, going back to where it says, be a father to the fatherless. See, those, whether it was white men or black men in my church, they didn't want to teach me none of that stuff. right? They didn't care what this seed grew into. They didn't care what type of tree I became. And they didn't care because I'm black, and they just assumed that I was going to be a terrible tree no matter what. So, if you're out there and you have, I don't care if they're, 17, 18, 30, 40, or 50 years old, and I don't care if you're 80 or 90 years old, you have kids in this world, and you were your children's first God. You were your children's first love. You. And that, I don't know if you've forgotten your relationship with your parents or the tie that binds you and your parents, but that is a huge deal. And think of, I don't know what it's like being a girl and being raised by a dad or not having your mom, but think of all this. I think with a girl, she ends up being, what's the word when you're fast? Some type of hussy. You're you're a stripper. Maybe you're a prostitute. Maybe you're not well put together. Maybe you get married and divorced. Maybe you let men treat you terribly. If you're a boy turning into a man, maybe you end up in prison. Maybe you end up mistreating the women in your life. Maybe you end up being a deadbeat dad. A lot of that has to do with the examples of the parents or the adults you had in your life growing up, right? You spend 18 years with these people, right? And you're not their age, right? It's not like I'm 30 and your parent is 30 years old and you're 30 years old. That would be a peer, right? That would be like, I think a lot of times my mom thought I was a coworker. I'm not a coworker. I'm 6. That means I have a 6-year-old brain. I'm 12. That means I had a 12-year-old brain at 12, right? And I want to be 25 with a 25-year-old brain. But if you're not raising me like an 8-year-old when I'm 8, you're not raising me like a 15-year-old when I'm 15, then when I'm 20, I'm more than likely going to have a 9 or a 10-year-old brain. And that has nothing to do with me being lazy or me being a bad seed. That has everything to do with parents and adults around the child.